What if everything you think you know about Queen Elizabeth's death is a lie? For 45 years, she ruled England with an iron fist wrapped in silk gloves, the Virgin Queen, the woman who defeated the Spanish Armada and turned England into a global power. But in March 1603, something happened at Richmond Palace that courtiers spent decades trying to hide. The official story: she died peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by loyal servants. The reality? Witnesses gave conflicting accounts. Evidence mysteriously vanished. And certain people who were there that night, they changed their stories. Here's what really happened in Elizabeth's final days, and why powerful people wanted it buried forever. The mask begins to slip. By 1600, Elizabeth was 67 years old, ancient by Tudor standards, but admitting weakness, that would be signing her own death warrant, so she created the most elaborate deception in royal history. Every morning, servants would spend hours applying a mask of white lead paint mixed with vinegar to her face. This toxic concoction covered the smallpox scars that had ravaged her skin decades earlier. Her teeth, rotted black from sugar addiction, were hidden behind closed-lip smiles or strategic positioning during audiences. The wig situation was even more theatrical. Elizabeth owned over 80 wigs, each more elaborate than the last. Why? Because by her 60s, she was almost completely bald. Courtiers whispered that her natural hair had fallen out from years of lead poisoning. The same makeup that was slowly killing her was destroying her appearance. But here's where it gets weird. She began talking to her portraits, not metaphorically, literally having conversations with painted versions of herself from decades past. Servants reported finding her at 3 a.m., standing before a portrait from her coronation, asking it for advice. Her hands shook so violently she couldn't sign documents without assistance. Yet in public, she maintained the illusion of strength through carefully choreographed performances. Every gesture was rehearsed. She started wearing gloves constantly because her fingernails had turned black. Witnesses described them as dead-looking and frighteningly dark. Yet medical records from the time completely sanitized. By 1602, Elizabeth's inner circle was essentially running a psychological operation. They controlled who saw her, when, and under what lighting conditions. The Virgin Queen had become a carefully maintained illusion, and the cracks were starting to show. The succession nightmare. Elizabeth's refusal to name an heir was political genius turned deadly gamble. For 45 years, she had weaponized uncertainty. Foreign kings, ambitious nobles, even her own parliament, everyone was kept guessing. Would she marry? Would she adopt? Would she finally point to someone and say, "You're next"? The ambiguity gave her power, but by 1603, it was about to tear England apart. Behind palace doors, courtiers were picking sides like vultures circling a dying animal. Robert Cecil, her chief minister, was secretly corresponding with James VI of Scotland. The Earl of Essex supporters, still bitter about his execution 2 years earlier, were whispering about alternative candidates. Catholic nobles saw an opportunity to restore their faith to the throne. Elizabeth knew exactly what was happening, and she seemed to enjoy it. During her final Christmas court in 1602, she allegedly told the French ambassador, "I may not be here next Christmas, but England will survive the chaos. Not England will be fine. Chaos." She knew her death would trigger a succession crisis, and part of her appeared to relish the drama. The Spanish were mobilizing troops in the Netherlands, ready to support any Catholic claimant. The Scottish border was fortified as James prepared for either peaceful succession or military intervention. London merchants were hoarding gold, anticipating civil war. Meanwhile, Elizabeth's most trusted advisors were essentially running a shadow government, making decisions she was either unwilling or unable to make. They were forging documents, intercepting letters, and eliminating potential troublemakers, all while pretending to serve a queen who was rapidly losing her grip on reality. By early 1603, England wasn't really being ruled by Elizabeth anymore. It was being managed by a small group of men who were desperately trying to prevent the kingdom from exploding the moment she drew her last breath. The strange behavior. In her final months, Elizabeth was exhibiting behavior so bizarre that her courtiers began whispering about demonic possession. It started with the sleeping. She refused to lie down in bed, insisting on sleeping while standing against pillows propped against the wall. When asked why, she cryptically responded, "If I lie down, I shall never rise again." But servants reported finding her in the middle of the night, eyes wide open, having conversations with invisible people. The portrait obsession escalated beyond mere talking. She began ordering servants to move specific paintings around the palace daily, claiming they were watching her wrong or judging her choices. A 1602 inventory shows she had portraits of herself moved 47 times in a single month. She was literally rearranging her own image obsessively. Then came the food paranoia. Elizabeth, who had always been a light eater, began refusing meals entirely, not from illness, but from fear of poisoning. She would only consume food prepared by one specific cook, and even then she demanded someone else taste every dish first. Then she chose her tasters from a rotating group of courtiers she suspected of disloyalty. Her ladies-in-waiting documented increasingly erratic behavior. She would spend hours staring at her hands, claiming she could see the marks of time moving across them like shadows. She began hoarding small objects, buttons, coins, pieces of fabric, hiding them throughout her chambers like a magpie. Most disturbing were the midnight wanderings. Guards reported finding her in the palace gardens at 2 a.m., dressed only in her nightgown, searching for something she couldn't explain. When questioned, she would claim she was looking for her younger self, or trying to find where she left her happiness. The breaking point came in February 1603. During a routine court session, Elizabeth suddenly stood up and began dancing, alone, to music only she could hear. For 20 minutes, the most powerful monarch in Europe swayed and spun while her horrified court watched in silence. When she finally stopped, she looked around confused and asked, "Why is everyone staring at me?" Her inner circle began implementing what they called management protocols, essentially treating their queen like a dangerous patient who needed constant supervision. The final act. On March 10, 1603, Elizabeth moved to Richmond Palace for what everyone knew would be her final performance. But the official account of her last days reads like a carefully edited script, because that's exactly what it was. The peaceful decline narrative begins falling apart when you compare witness testimonies. Robert Cecil claimed she spent her final week in quiet prayer and gentle conversation. But Lady Scrope, one of her closest attendants, wrote in a private letter that Elizabeth was raging against the dying of the light and speaking to people who were not there. Here's where it gets genuinely eerie. On March 18th, Elizabeth allegedly pointed to her throat and said, "I am not well," her first admission of illness in months. But 3 different witnesses recorded 3 completely different final words. Cecil claimed she said, "all my possessions for a moment of time." Lady Scrope insisted it was, "I wish not to live any longer." A third courtier swore she said nothing at all. The death scene itself has more plot holes than a bad mystery novel. Elizabeth supposedly died around 3 a.m. on March 24th, but the official announcement wasn't made until nearly 11 a.m. What happened during those 8 hours? The palace was in complete lockdown. No one entered or left her chambers except for a select group of 6 people. Even more suspicious, her body was immediately moved and prepared for burial by the same 6 individuals. No independent physician examined her. No autopsy was performed. Highly unusual for a monarch's death. The official cause was listed as old age and melancholy, which isn't even a medical diagnosis. But here's the detail that should make your skin crawl. Servants reported that Elizabeth's chamber windows were found wide open on the morning of March 24th, despite the fact that she had ordered them sealed shut weeks earlier because she was afraid of the night air. Someone had opened those windows after she died. The most damning evidence? A letter from the Spanish ambassador, written 3 days before Elizabeth's official death, mentioning recent developments regarding the English succession. How did he know something was about to happen before it officially happened? The final act of Elizabeth's reign wasn't a peaceful death. It was a carefully orchestrated cover-up that began before she even drew her last breath. The cover-up. Within hours of Elizabeth's death, the most efficient historical sanitization campaign in English history was already underway, and the masterminds, the very people who supposedly loved her most, Robert Cecil, moved with surgical precision. By noon on March 24th, he had already dispatched riders to Scotland with news of James VI's succession, documents that had clearly been prepared weeks in advance. But here's the smoking gun. Those same documents contain details about Elizabeth's final wishes that no one else had witnessed. The first wave of evidence tampering began immediately. Elizabeth's personal physician, Dr. John Dee, was found dead in his chambers just 3 days after the Queen's death. Official cause: heart failure. Convenient timing for a man who had been documenting Elizabeth's mysterious symptoms for months. Lady Scrope, who had written those damning private letters about Elizabeth's final behavior, suddenly recanted her statements. Her revised testimony, submitted to the Privy Council, painted a completely different picture, one that aligned perfectly with Cecil's official narrative. What changed her mind? Her family's debts were mysteriously forgiven, and her son received a lucrative court appointment. The most brazen cover-up involved Elizabeth's private chambers. Within a week of her death, they were completely gutted and renovated. Tapestries, furniture, personal items. Everything was either destroyed or relocated. When questioned, Cecil claimed it was standard protocol for royal transitions. But palace records show no such protocol existed for previous monarchs. Even more damning, several key witnesses simply vanished from historical records. Sir Thomas Heneage, who had been present during Elizabeth's final weeks, disappears from all court documents after March 1603. His estate was quietly absorbed by the crown, and his family never spoke publicly about his whereabouts. The official death announcement, when analyzed by modern historians, contains anachronisms and impossibilities. It describes events that couldn't have happened in the sequence presented, includes quotes from people who weren't present, and references conversations that contradict other documented evidence. But Cecil's masterstroke was the funeral itself. By creating the most elaborate royal funeral in English history, complete with a procession that lasted hours and cost a fortune, he shifted public attention away from questions about her death to celebration of her life. The spectacle was so overwhelming that few people thought to ask uncomfortable questions about what had really happened at Richmond Palace. The cover-up worked so well that it took historians over 400 years to start noticing the inconsistencies. So what really killed Elizabeth? The theories that emerge when you dig beneath the official story are far more disturbing than simple old age. Theory 1. Mercury poisoning. Elizabeth's white face paint contained deadly levels of mercury and lead. But here's what's chilling. Analysis of similar cosmetics from the period shows they would cause exactly the symptoms Elizabeth exhibited: tremors, paranoia, insomnia, and eventual neurological breakdown. The blackened fingernails? Classic mercury poisoning. The conversations with portraits? Mercury-induced hallucinations. But some historians whisper about something darker. In 1999, a renovation at Richmond Palace uncovered a hidden chamber beneath Elizabeth's former rooms. Inside, bottles containing traces of arsenic, antimony, and other poisons. The discovery was quickly classified and removed from public access. Why hide 400-year-old bottles unless they revealed something explosive? Theory 2 gets really ugly: assisted suicide. Several coded letters between Cecil and his associates, discovered in the 1980s and largely ignored by mainstream historians, contain references to ending her suffering and merciful conclusion. Elizabeth, facing complete mental collapse and aware of the succession crisis her death would trigger, may have chosen her own exit. The most disturbing theory involves religious extremists within her own court. Elizabeth's Protestant reforms had created powerful enemies who saw her death as divine opportunity. Some evidence suggests a faction led by radical Puritans may have accelerated her demise to install a more religiously compliant monarch. The mysterious 8-hour gap between her death and the announcement? Time to stage the scene and eliminate evidence. Here's the detail that keeps historians awake at night. Elizabeth's body showed signs of rapid decomposition when it was finally viewed by independent witnesses days later. This isn't consistent with natural death, but it is consistent with certain types of poisoning that were known to Renaissance assassins. The Spanish ambassador's prescient letter becomes even more sinister when you realize he wasn't just predicting Elizabeth's death. He was describing specific details about how the succession would be handled, details that suggest foreign intelligence services knew exactly what was planned. Perhaps most terrifying, if Elizabeth, the most powerful monarch in Europe, could be eliminated so efficiently that the truth stayed buried for centuries, who else in history met a similar fate? Her death wasn't just the end of an era, it was a masterclass in how to murder a queen and get away with it.